the Center for Justice, and I do the CJHD without knowing what it stands for. So the Center for Justice and Human Dignity for sponsoring this, and to Aleph, and especially for asking me. I can't tell you how flattered I was and remain to be asked to talk about Jack Weinstein a little bit at this event. You know, as Alan mentioned, I grew up as a trial lawyer in his courtroom. And just when he thought he was making a little progress, training me how to be a trial lawyer, I became his colleague on the Eastern District Bench. So for 32 years, Jack and I went to work every morning at the federal courthouse in Brooklyn. And for the last 22 of them, we were brothers on the great bench in the Eastern District of New York. We had coffee with our colleagues most mornings. And I said brothers, we're brothers only in the sense that judges refer to one another as brothers and sisters. He was definitely the big brother in my relationship with him. This conference is obviously about sentencing, and I'm going to turn to that topic soon, because Jack, as you already heard from Rabbi Lipskar and from Mark, was indeed a giant in the space. But he was a giant before he was even appointed to the bench in April of 1967 by Lyndon Johnson. For a few minutes, one of the lawyers looked at his watch and said, "Where the hell is the judge?" So you have to kind of look and be Jack Weinstein to really pull that off. He's a man of action. He was a man of action. You know, if the case turned out to turn importantly on the features, physical features of a place where the relevant events occurred, he took everybody with him, including a court reporter, to visit the location. If an important issue before him implicated special expertise, he would convene a little mini symposium of the relevant scientists or other experts who would engage directly with him and collaboratively with one another and the lawyers to try to help the parties understand really difficult subjects. And Jack, in the first appearance, asked the defense lawyer if he anticipated any motions, and the lawyer said he was thinking about moving to suppress some statements because the Miranda warnings weren't given, and he was thinking about moving to suppress some evidence that was seized pursuant to a consent search, but consent wasn't given. We're all sitting around the table in the well of the courtroom. It seemed much more like a book club than it did a federal courtroom. And in any other courtroom, a schedule would have been set for written motions and oral argument and a hearing. Instead, Jack turns to me and he points with his chin to the person sitting next to me and says, "Is this your agent?" I said, "Yes." Jack said, "Raise your right hand." He swore him in. He turned to me and said, "Go ahead." So this agent who's sitting there enjoying this kind of Starbucks-like atmosphere suddenly is wide-eyed. He says, "What's happening?" I said, "I think we just began the suppression hearing." And that was just the way he ran his courtroom. Trials were an enormous pleasure before him, but again, they took getting used to. Jack knew a little bit about evidence. He did kind of write that Bible, and it's been cited dozens of times by justices of the Supreme Court of the United States, literally tens of thousands of times in just the published opinions of the lower courts. But I'm here to tell you that not all of the Weinstein's rules of evidence can be found in that treatise. For some of them, you just have to try a case in front of them. And the only example I'll give you today is you've got enough rule of evidence preclusion, which I ran into more than once. Each time it was the same. I would pose a question on direct examination, sustained, right here, from up there. I'd scurry up, geek lawyer that I was, I'd scurry up to the sidebar, say, "Judge, it's perfectly admissible evidence, and it's quite probative. I don't really get why you just said sustained." especially when nobody said objection. And he says to me, you have enough evidence already, let's finish this trial. And the first time this happened, I started explaining why it wasn't cumulative evidence, but he cuts me off. He says, look, I'm not telling you it's cumulative. I'm telling you, you have enough to prove your case. We're going to get this trial over with. But he's got, the visuals of Jack Weinstein include that big smile on his face. He was a very endearing man. And he's got that smile on his face, so I know it's okay to push back. And I say, look, Judge, I'm really happy to hear you think we have enough evidence to convict, but you don't really get a vote. So I'll make you a deal. Let's tell the jurors that when they've heard enough evidence to convict, they should raise their hand. And when the 12 hands go up, I'll rest my case. And he laughs and he says, no, let's just excuse this witness and we'll go to summations. And then he was so smart, so funny, he gets the last laugh. He points to the court reporter's machine. He says to me, you have your record for appeal. And of course, the reason he's got that huge smile on his face is he knows exactly what I'm thinking, which is that record's only going to do me some good when we amend the Constitution to get rid of the double jeopardy clause, because they have no right to it. But he was friendly and fair. He was fair to everyone. I tried a crime boss in his courtroom. He thought it very important not to permit prosecutors to have overnight to give their rebuttal summation. The boss of the Colombo crime family who I was on trial with, and the defense summations lasted a long time, and it was 9 o'clock at night. And the defense summation finished, and he said to me, okay, Mr. Gleeson, go ahead. So I go up to the sidebar and I said, come on, Judge, what are you doing to these jurors? They're not going to stay awake for this. I've got some important stuff I want to tell them. He said, no, go ahead. So I stand up, and he comes down off the bench and sits in one of the vacant alternate chairs. And the jurors like, whoa, the judge is here waiting to hear my summation. He had this baked-in sense of fairness to both sides. His compassion was just legendary. He had what our colleague Gene Nickerson, who he was very close to, we call the milk of human kindness. My favorite story about Jack Weinstein is in the multi-defendant drug trial he was presiding over, in which one of the peripheral defendants was in the case solely because of her unfortunate love interest in the main defendant, the drug dealer's girlfriend. And despite the ample evidence against her, Jack said when the government rested that even taking the evidence in the light most favorable to the government and drawing all inferences in the government's favor, no rational juror could find her guilty. And he dismissed the charges. And he turned to her and said sternly, now get out of here and don't you ever do it again. As a colleague, he was just a godsend. I was so lucky to be in what I hoped was one of his inner orbits. I grew up in an immigrant's household and I had parents who were very short on education and money. They were short on pretty much everything except faith and kids. Both of which they had in great abundance. I was the youngest of 7. I came home from the hospital. That made 9 of us. We're in a 2-bedroom apartment in an Irish immigrant enclave in the Bronx. And don't get me wrong, we were so much better off than so many other people. But my parents, here's the point, my parents were like the quintessential little people. And because of their hard work and opportunities they afforded me, I ended up, at 40 years of age, getting nominated to the judgeship vacated by Jack Weinstein himself. Right? The judge who, more than any other judge in our history, looked out for the little people. And if 22 years on the bench taught me nothing else, it taught me how to look out for the little people. And here's something about Jack Weinstein that can't be overstated. He taught a generation, a couple of generations, on the bench 50 plus years, of colleagues that Even though trial judges occupy that lowest rung on the Article 3 ladder, they are uniquely positioned to make real and positive differences, not just in the lives of the people who come before them, although that's most important, but in society as well. Over more than half a century of scholarship and kindness and energy and dedication to delivering justice to all, he taught us not only the difference that we can make, but that we must make. Let me turn specifically and briefly to sentencing. I want to share 3 vignettes with you about Jack Weinstein that, to my mind, together say so much about him as essentially the father of Aleph and his role in sentencing. The first is a conversation in my chambers about his experience in World War II. As I mentioned, he served in the Asian theater. He was on a submarine in the Sea of Japan. And he said to me that at a point right after the second nuclear bomb had already been dropped, Japan was about to surrender, as it did days later, that the radar on his ship, on his submarine, detected a ship, possibly a freighter or a passenger vessel, and the captain of the submarine that Jack served on was prepared to sink it. Jack told me in my chambers he tried to intervene, saying it might be carrying civilians and the war was essentially over, and everyone knew it. Captain replied that he had his orders. They sank what turned out to be a freighter, killing a number of civilians. And more than 60 years later, he told me he felt terrible about being part of that, about not speaking up effectively in that situation. The second vignette is when he received this prestigious Edward Weinfeld Award from the New York County Lawyers Association in 2004. It was before Booker. He asked me to present the award to him, which was an honor for me, and in about 15 minutes worth of remarks, I told some lighthearted stories, to some extent, kind of what I've done in part here now. Talked about several cases I had in his courtroom. I presented him with both the award and an adoring audience. I should have talked to him ahead of time about what he was going to talk about, because he'd come to he followed me to the lectern and immediately blasted the sentencing guidelines, which were still mandatory at the time, and likened all the judges in the room who refused to depart from them, of whom there are about 3 dozen, to the judges in Nazi Germany. Yeah. And then the third is when Jack came to my chambers. You know, he had law clerks like Mark, and then he had us Article 3 law clerks. And in a very important respect, I was his law clerk. And he came to my chambers to talk through his intention to defy the law by refusing to impose a mandatory minimum sentence in a child porn case. We didn't discuss the fact that he would be reversed. That was a given. And one of the great things I think he taught me, my first 10 years on the bench with him, is just because you're afraid you're going to get reversed, doesn't mean you shouldn't reach the decision is right, that you think is right. My last 12 years on the bench, he taught me that even if you know in fact you're going to get reversed, don't let that be a deterrent to doing what you think is right. Anyway, he came from me and helped in honing his rationale in this case, but I was really concerned only about him. There are very few good vehicles for flouting an unambiguous law, and he hadn't chosen the best one. It was a defendant who was alleged to have engaged in the hands-on sexual molestation crime. I was afraid the Court of Appeals, and Alan alluded to this, he had a running battle with the Court of Appeals for decades. I was afraid they were going to direct that he be removed from that case and all such cases and maybe taken out of the criminal wheel entirely. I told him that, but he was adamant, and it was the only time in my interactions with him over the years that he seemed even slightly annoyed with me. He said to me, you know, if these mandatory sentences are wrong, and they are, then they're wrong for every single defendant, not just the sympathetic ones. The prosecutor thinks somebody deserves at least 15 years. He or she should act like a lawyer and convince me of that. Sentencing decisions are supposed to be made by judges, he tells me. Which is, of course, right. Not by the executive branch. Justice process to begin with. Why don't we do it up front? And maybe if we have a U.S. attorney that's amenable to it, maybe we can avoid prison for folks. And we had this case, Arthur S. gets arrested in his late 40s for a marijuana case, And he had 13 priors. He had the sheet of an addict, right? All simple possession and theft cases. Addicted since he was age 14, so he had an addiction that was more than 30 years old. Several previous attempts at outpatient drug treatment had failed. He joined our relatively newly founded drug court, went into inpatient, then outpatient treatment, sat with us and the other participants in the drug court, got himself a commercial driver's license, became a New York City Parks supervisor, became the centerpiece, the model of his family instead of the embarrassment. And I wrote a little bit about Arthur, and subsequently, after the note that I'll describe to you in a minute, and I'm going to take a while, I'm describing it to you, but subsequently Arthur spoke when Eric Holder came to our courthouse for a special session of our drug court and our SOS program that Amina presided over and still does. And an unbelievably impressive example of what we're capable of, right? If we have the open mind that we should have.